A radio button is a type of button that is mostly used in OR type of selections. For our example, we will be trying to copy the style used in material.io. Now, one valid question would be why even create one when Qt already offers it? The short answer would be flexibility. We want to be able to adapt this to our own liking without limitations. Let me show you how to create it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to create two files. One is going to be our radio button. The second one is supposed to group all our buttons, and that's why we're going to call it RadioGroup. The next thing we need to do is to add them in our QML directory. Now, in order to apply these changes, we need to restart Qt Creator. For now, our files are empty. We need to make them a valid QML file. So we're just going to add the base structure. This is enough for now, and also for our radio button. Now, if in my main window, when I import buttons, it should be visible. Okay, so here you can see all our free components that we made until now. Let's add the radio button. And the first thing I'm going to do is just make it easier for myself. I'm going to center align it and run our program. For now, we have an empty screen, and this is because our custom radio button is an empty item. So the first thing our radio button needs is its visuals. So let's create, first of all, a rectangle component, and it's going to be empty from the inside, but the borders need to be colored. So what we're going to do is make the rectangle transparent, but we're going to make the borders colored. So the border width is going to be 2, and the border color is going to be blue. We still don't see anything because we haven't defined the height or width of our button. And there we go. This is our circular button. Let's make it circular. Okay, nice. Now the second thing is the inner circle, and the inner circle is going to be filled. The idea is to center align it in its parent and make it a little bit smaller than its parent. So the height and width is going to be, let's say, 80%. And the color is going to be the border color. Okay, nice. Now we just have to make it round. And in my opinion, this is a little bit too big, so we're going to make it smaller. Let's say 65%. Yeah, this looks much better. So the visuals are here. The next thing we need is to have a checked state that's going to decide if the inner circle should be visible or not. So we're going to define a property. It's going to be called checked. Default will be false. Our inner circle is going to be visible exclusively if it's checked. Actually, let's not use parent. Let's use the ID. Because in case we move something around, parent could not be valid anymore. So this is just to be in case. And yeah, now it's invisible because it's not checked. The next thing we need is to make a way to set the checked state on or off. For that, we're going to use a mouse area. A mouse area is a QML component that allows us to register mouse events. Now, the key factor in mouse area is that we have to define the height and width of the component so that it knows in which areas it should register the mouse events. In our case, it's the whole component. So we're just going to use anchors fill. We're going to enable the hover state. And on clicked, we're just gonna toggle the checked state. Let's check if it works. And yeah, it works. Now this is still not enough. In order to make our components nice and shiny, we need to add a few elements more. If we hover over the component, nothing is happening. So it would be nice that it changes a little bit in color or opacity. I will change the opacity. So the whole component should change the opacity to a little bit lower when it's hovered. First thing we need to do is define the ID of our mouse area. And the opacity, if the mouse area contains the mouse, should be lower than if it's not containing the mouse. So let's say 70%. And now let's check it. It's actually changing the opacity, but this is not enough. It's barely visible. So we're gonna say 50%. Okay, this is much better. So 50% is our sweet spot. The next thing is that our mouse cursor stays the same. And in most scenarios, that's not the case. So let's change that. So the mouse area has a nice property that's called cursor shape. And what it does is change the cursor shape if it's registering the mouse events. So we're gonna check if it contains the mouse. If it does, then we're gonna use a pointing hand cursor. If not, we're going to use the regular cursor. Now it's much better. Now what we did is enable the checked state to be automatically changed on click. But in some cases, in my experience, that is not preferable. So what we're going to allow to the people who use our component is to let them decide if they want to use our check behavior or not. So we're going to define a property that's called custom check behavior. and default will be false. But the key thing is here that our onClick behavior will not be automatically included if the custom check behavior is on. This still works, but if we set our custom check behavior to true, now the clicking doesn't work anymore. So that's preferable because some people would want to implement their behavior on click. And with that said, we need to define a signal that's going to allow people to catch the event on click. We're going to define a signal that's going to be called click, and on click, we're just going to emit the signal click. So for example, if we would want to catch the clicked signal, all we had to do is define the onClick behavior. And let's say it says I'm click, clear the console. And now when you click, it says I'm click. I'm going to remove this. And that's basically it as it goes for our custom radio button. Of course, you could change something like adding animations, but that is something that we're going to cover in the later tutorials. For now, we're going to keep it simple. Now let's use multiple buttons. I'm just going to copy paste this real quick. And now when we use our buttons, the problem is every button can be checked at once. So that is not the preferred behavior. The whole point of radio buttons is that only one can be checked. So that's why we're going to use our second component that we defined, and that is custom button group. So the idea is the custom button group should keep track of all our buttons and allow only one to be checked at a time. The first thing we need is to keep track of all the buttons that are included. So we're going to create a property that's going to be called buttons. It's going to be empty as default, and we need one more property, and that's going to be the pre-selection index. What this is going to do is pre-select something on the start of the app. If, for example, you want the first button to be clicked as default, or maybe you want to save the state, and in the next reload, some other button should be checked as default. So we're going to create the property, and the default value will be -1. So it reminds people that it needs to be used. And how we're going to remind people is just adding a console log. So when the component is completed and the pre-selection is -1, we're just going to console log, please define a pre-selection index. This is just going to be a warning. Of course, we're going to cover this case. So what we're going to do is go through all the components, check a pre-selection index. And the other case that we need to cover is if no buttons have been added to our component. So if no buttons are included in our component, we're just going to warn them. And now it's warning me that the length is undefined, so buttons will be as default an empty list. In this case though, we're just gonna exit our function because there is no need to use it if there are no buttons attached. Now let's do the main job, and that is pre-selecting a button. How we're gonna do that is check if the pre-selection index has been defined. If it has not been defined, we will select the first component. If it was defined, we will select the component. So what we're gonna do is use the pre-selection index to check one button of our list. Pre-selection now should work, and let's try it out. We have defined our custom button group. The only thing missing now is to add the buttons to our button group, and that's going to be all the children from our column layout. And yeah, it works. Now keep in mind that this is the preferred way if all the children are buttons. If you have some component that doesn't have a checked state, you will probably trigger an error. Now if we set the pre-selection index to, let's say, 1, it will set the second component because we're starting from 0. Now the only thing missing is to keep only one button checked, and the easiest way to do it is to keep track of all the clicked signals and just change the check state on a clicked signal. For that, we're gonna need a repeater. The repeater is gonna allow us to have unlimited amount of buttons and keep track of all of them. Our model is gonna be buttons, and this is a dirty trick to use connections in a repeater. Our target is going to be a single button from our list, but the repeater is going to create the amount of instances equal to the number of buttons that have been assigned. So if we have 5 buttons, we're going to have 5 connections for each button. We're going to attach to the onClicked signal. Now we're just going to use a for loop that is going to check which button has been clicked. We're going to ignore that button, and all the other buttons are going to be unchecked and set false. So let's see if it works now. And yeah, now only one button here is going to be checked. Now the missing thing here would be a text. Now you can approach this in 2 ways. You can add it directly to the custom radio button, or you can create another component that is going to use the custom radio button and add text to it. Just to show you, I'm going to keep my component simple and just use the button. But for sake of showing, I'm going to show you how to create a component that's going to use text and our custom radio button. So we need to create another component, and we're going to call it custom radio text button. We're going to add it to our QML there. You already know how it works. And we need to make it at least a valid QML component. So now if I would try to add custom radio text button, it wouldn't be visible. And the quick fix for this is just restarting Qt Creator. So what we're going to do is just replace them with our radio button. Now if I would try to run our app, we would have a bunch of errors, and that is because we're using a bunch of stuff and our component is empty. So the next thing we're going to do is use our row layout to make it simple for us. In that layout, we're going to use our custom radio button and add text next to it. Now why it's showing up as custom radio button 01 is because it's in the same folder, and we don't have to import it. We can use it just like this. Let's define the height and width. It's going to be the parent height. and the width is going to be the same as height. Now let's add the text. I'm going to add an ID to our button. And one important thing is, if somebody else would want to change something on our radio button while using our radio text button, we should allow them to gain access to it. So we're going to create an alias. An alias is a reference to our QML component. Let's set a text next to it. We're going to use text, and let's set the text to something just tested out. Okay, now that we added our text component, our radio buttons have become smaller, and that is because until now they were using the whole height of the screen and dividing them in an equal amount amongst the cells. Now it's working properly. In my opinion, they are too close together. So what we're gonna do, I'm gonna add spacing to it, and let's set the spacing to 15. Keep in mind that in a smaller button, the spacing of 15 could be too much, so you can change it however you see fit. I'll comment out our custom radio group until we're finished with this. So the radio button text is a little bit too small, so we're gonna change the font pixel size, let's say to 30. What we need to allow is for the users to change the text accordingly to their wishes, so we're gonna expose it the same way we exposed our radio button. So in this case, all looks perfect, but there is a slight catch. Our preferred width is the same as height. So what is happening here is we defined our radio button, but the radio text is out of bounds of our component. So if I would change the width to our proper width, so let's say preferred width would be parent, and change that for all our components, what would happen is this: the radio button text went to the right. And that is not something that is a fault of spacing. It is just the way that layouts work. So if there is no component pushing them to the left, they are gonna take up the space however it wants. So what we need to do is define the text width so it fills out all the space in between. So the text width should be the full width of the component, excluding the radio button. And now it works properly again. Now, as you might notice, I commented out our custom button group, and that is because it's creating problems, as you can see here. And the main problem is that now it's looking at the custom radio text button, and that doesn't have properties like check or signals like on click. The trick is just to provide them with the radio button and not our whole component, and that is the custom radio text button. So we need to create a for loop in our buttons property. We're just gonna go through each radio text button that is actually the child now, and we're gonna push to our list the radio button that is inside of our custom radio text button component, and just return that list. And now it works again. This has been pretty simple. As we progress more with our videos, we'll be creating more and more complex components. Let me know what component you would like to see next.